to welcome Ronnie. Well done. Um, as you all know, that one of the cornerstones of the ODC's program, which is our areas of concentration, things that we want to work on, promote, is support of public education. And we are just delighted to have you here to talk about how you came to where you are now and what you are looking to for the future. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. I'd like to start with a question that I'll ask is how many of you have attended public schools or have loved ones who have attended public schools? If you would just kind of raise your hand. Wow, that's fantastic. I think, Carol, we can't see you, but of everyone on screen, every one of us have had some connection to public schools. So what I'd like to say is that even for those who did not raise their hand, if there were any, everyone benefits from public education. We know that when we invest in education, we have healthier communities. We don't need to spend as much in rehabilitation. We're better informed about how to live as a community. People have better access to resources, better economic development. And I could go on about the benefits of investing in public education. So my name is Rani Dasi, and I will share what's happening here locally in our Chapel Hill-Carrboro City Schools, and then make some remarks about the state of public education in North Carolina and some ideas on how we might engage. If I go back to my childhood, my earliest memory, I'm sitting with my mother and she's guiding my fingers under the letters in my book. And I remember that feeling of discovery when the letters turned into words and the words turned into stories. So I was the eldest of 10 siblings, if you can imagine that. We were a family that didn't have a lot of financial resources, but my mom really embedded in us how important it was to constantly be curious and to learn. And so I earned a degree in industrial engineering and management science from Northwestern and MBA in finance and accounting from University of Chicago. And my professional work is in corporate finance and strategy. But education transformed my life, and I'm committed to creating an environment where every child has access to quality education. In 2015, I was elected to the Chapel Hill-Carrboro City Schools Board of Education and subsequently re-elected in 2019 and 2023. And I've served in a number of education organizations, and I won't get into all the list because I want to really get into what's happening in our schools across North Carolina. So just as some background, the primary responsibility of the Board of Education is to set educational goals and policies for the school district. And these are in alignment with state and federal laws. And really the role of local school boards is to align those policies and practices with our community values. And so we want to represent how our community values education and the way that we practice instruction in our community. So one example is we value practices locally that support classroom instruction. So we invest so that we have additional teaching assistants in our elementary classrooms above the state funded levels. We use some of our local funding to do that investment. So Chapel Hill-Carrboro has long been considered a really successful schools district. So we look at our high-level metrics. On average, our students have high graduation rates, high scores on standardized tests, and they typically successfully gain admission into their desired institutions of higher learning or whatever their next steps are. But when we look at the details, we see a district that still has progress to make to improve education outcomes for all children. So for example, if we look at our end of grade scores for reading and math, a composite score for grades 3 through 8 and science grades 5 and 8, our overall student proficiency score was about 71%, which is among the highest, if not the highest in the state. But when we look at the details, we don't look as strong. Our Black student proficiency average was 38%. That means about 60% of our Black students did not show proficient on end of grade testing. For our Latinx students, about 42% of them achieved proficient scores. And for students with disability, the average proficiency score was 28%.
Ooh.
For perspective, white students average about 86%.
Mm.
And in some instances, some outcomes for our students of color are lower than outcomes for similar groups and other less resourced districts. And I want to be clear on that. So we are a well-resourced district relative to other districts in North Carolina, and you'll hear me give context on how that's not great in the national environment, but we should be doing better. And we recognize there's work to be done to instruct students so that all of our student groups move closer to our goal of 100% proficiency. So we're focusing on strengthening foundations. We have drafted a strategic plan with specific goals and measures. I'll just quickly talk about our 5 priorities. The first one is a culture of safety and wellness. This is about safe, supportive schools with emotional and social and cultural competencies and resources across the entire district. A second priority is instructional excellence. So how do we make sure that we're preparing students for that curiosity, that love of learning, and not just being in the classroom and like, I'm bored and I can't connect to how and what I'm learning. The third priority is empowering, equipping, and investing in our people. So we know that a quality teacher is one of the most important elements of instruction, and that's a key focus for us in the Chapel Hill-Carrboro City School District. Our fourth priority is equitable and transparent fiscal stewardship and operations. And so tax funds support our schools. We want to let our community know how we're using that funding and make sure that they're supportive of the way that those dollars are being allocated. And then our fifth priority is strengthening family and community engagement. So we know we could do everything in the schools, but without family and community engagement, we could still falter in our goal to getting all of our students to that 100% proficient goal. And so within each of these priority areas, we have specific goals, but for the sake of time, I'll just share a few key goals under the instructional excellence priority. So one of the goals is to increase proficiency of all student groups toward 95%. So we're interested in making sure that everyone is learning, not just looking like we're a successful district because we have some students that pull the averages up, but we really want to support learning for all of our students. We're also interested in increasing the percentage of what we call CTE, continuing technical education credentials for our high school students. So these are certifications that students can earn to do things like pre-professional work, nursing, automotive repair. And we know that some students have interest in those areas. And so we want to encourage them. Every student might not have an interest immediately in going to a 4-year institution. And so how do we continue to support all of the students in whatever their interests are? And then we want to increase the overall graduation rate to 95% of students graduating within 4 years. We currently have the highest graduation rate in the state, but again, if you look at the numbers of students who are proficient, you might imagine that we might be needing to make sure that when we graduate students, that we're graduating them in a way that enables them to be successful. So how do we do this? Well, we're focusing on the things that most impact instruction. So we recently conducted a curriculum audit, and we're really focusing on consistent resources that help support the teachers across levels and across schools so that we're able to provide the most effective instruction to students. We're also looking at data to determine which students are not responding to this universal core instruction and what kind of enrichment and intervention opportunities do we need to offer them. We've recently taken on partnerships with some companies who do what we call high dosage tutoring. And that's where we push into regular classroom instruction to supplement some of the learning and use intervention periods to really help support students who may be a little bit behind or who may even need a little bit more instruction to accelerate. And then we're also focusing on recruiting and retaining quality teachers and staff and investing in our facilities to support safety and instruction. Behind that, we really need investment. And so we know, again, quality teachers are important. We continue to advocate for teacher and school employee compensation that helps us with recruitment and retention, community mental health resources. We're focusing on accountability systems. So we're understanding progress on our metrics. We're not waiting until we get to the end of the year and we see that a student has not been successful. We're doing check-ins along the way to say, how do we make sure that by the end of the year, our students will be successful toward those proficiency goals. And we're really focusing on renovating our school buildings. We're very, very excited to share that the Orange County Commissioners have recently decided to put a bond before the voters in November for a $300 million bond to repair our crumbling school facilities. And I don't know if you all have been in our schools recently, but they really don't reflect the way we value education. And it's not just the way they look. There are safety concerns and there are instructional adequacy concerns. Kids are bigger than they were when the schools were built 60 or 70 years ago. The safety needs, some of our schools have open campuses, and we know a lot more about how to implement safety protocols in our school facilities. And so those are the things that we're focusing on. And, I want to thank you all for your continued support and say we're just really fortunate to be a district with parents and students and community members who care about education. And so we're in a good position to really become a model for how education can be transformative. And with that, I'll shift a little bit to talk about what's happening across the state. So I talked about the potential for our district to be transformative with respect to education. But we are in a environment right now where the state legislature refuses to adequately fund in the public education. And so districts across North Carolina are struggling with skyrocketing teacher vacancies. We see significant declines in enrollment and teacher preparations. They're down by, within the UNC systems, about 50% over the last decade. And so that's impacting all the school districts' ability to recruit and retain teachers and staff. So I would say public education in North Carolina is in crisis. There are thousands of students in classrooms without a qualified teacher because of that continued underinvestment, increasing asks of teachers and school staff. Starting teacher pay in North Carolina is about $37,000. It ranks behind even Alabama and Mississippi, who increased their starting pay by 21% and 10% respectively. Tennessee and Arkansas have announced plans to raise starting teacher pay to $50,000. The top salary on the North Carolina salary schedule is $52,680, which a teacher reaches after 25 years in the profession. And when compared to its neighboring states, North Carolina has the lowest total benefit values for retirees, and teachers are paid less than their college-educated peers in other professions, about 25% less than comparable college graduates. So you might imagine how that creates a challenge for schools to attract and retain teachers. And it just continues to look more dire. I could tell you more statistics about teacher salary adjusted for inflation. It's lower in today's dollars than it was 9 years ago. And I mentioned the declining enrollment in teacher preparation programs. And so we know that competitive pay is a common sense solution to attract and retain talent. And we've seen dramatic results from investments in education. Over the pandemic, the federal government invested about $5 billion, and we saw significant gains in student results behind that investment. And so we're continuing to advocate for increased investment to support public schools. But there's other dire news. So along with the teacher shortage, we also see significant gaps in resources and funding for teaching assistants and books and materials, mental health resources, school nurses, psychologists, and on and on. There's a report from the Education Law Center that ranks North Carolina 50th in the country in school funding efforts. So our current state budget is just really focused on the wrong things. Instead of funding public education, they're using public tax dollars to fund private schools through vouchers. I think public funds derived from all the people should be used in a way that benefits all the people. And so there was a Senate bill and a House bill that were introduced in the 2021 legislative session that substantially expanded the voucher program, taking about $500 million away from public education that they're shifting into private school vouchers. So I'll pause and see what questions anyone has, or what how we are doing, what time I could go on. I've got a little bit more to talk about with respect to some ongoing legal actions across the state, but want to just pause and see how we are for time and if anybody has any questions about what we've covered so far.
Well,
Let's start here. Historically, North Carolina has been a leader in education and public education, so much so that it is one of the few states that embedded the obligation to provide every child in North Carolina with a sound basic education into the state constitution. And we know that investing in education has a significant return for the state, and we know that the state has funding. So it's a mystery why the legislature is refusing to fund schools. But in 1994, 5 low-wealth school districts sued the state, alleging that it failed to meet its constitutional duties to provide educational opportunities for all students. Other groups have subsequently joined the lawsuit, which you might have heard called the Leandro case, because the primary plaintiff, was a student named Rob Leandro, who was a student in the Hope County schools. And the North Carolina Supreme Court, so this case started in 1994. In 1997, the state Supreme Court ruled that indeed all students are entitled to a sound basic education. And then 7 years later, in 2004, a lower court ruled that the state was not providing this sound basic education and ordered that every classroom have a certified teacher, a well-trained principal, and necessary resources. The legislature said, nope, we're not investing in education, and they appealed to the state Supreme Court, where the justices upheld the lower court ruling. Unfortunately, over the next decade, the legislature continued to refuse to make the investments in education, and judges continued to find that the resources and funding of public schools were not being adequately met. So in 2000, and trying to think of the timeline, there's been so much legal action in this case, which is stunning, because why would you resist investing in public education? We know there's so many benefits, as we started with. But in 2017 or 18, Judge David Lee appointed an organization, West Ed, and they created a report laying out the problems and possible solutions for improving educational outcomes across the state. And they came up with what was called the Comprehensive Remedial Plan, which called for the state to make significant investment in public education, allocating $6.8 billion over the subsequent 8 years on initiatives such as reinvigorating the North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program, the Principals Fellows, pre-K, Smart Start, additional teachers, and on and on. But unfortunately, even though the state has billions of dollars in reserve, they continue to refuse to make this investment in education. And so the case continues nearly 30 years later. And so I come back again with, we should all be deeply concerned about the future of education. I'm not going to end us here, so we're going to keep coming. We'll come back to where there are some rays of hope. But what I want to leave us with is that the climate of underinvestment requires us to be vigilant and continue to advocate to sustain public education. So I mentioned in the beginning that I'm an industrial engineer and by training. And so I always think about like how to create structural solutions. How do we build solutions that are sustainable and that address root causes of issues? I will continue to say that education is the best investment to address so many of the issues we face: civic disengagement, access to nutrition, to healthcare, to housing, to community building, etc. In fact, Nelson Mandela called education the most powerful tool to change the world, and I believe that. And even more than my belief, I'm an example of that. And so, in summary, we need leaders who understand the value of public education, who work to understand what makes public education successful, and who act to invest in those areas. Specifically, we need to refocus public dollars to invest in public schools. We need to reinstate some of the wonderful programs that were national models, like the Teaching Fellows Program and other measures to rebuild the teacher pipeline. We need increased investments in facility improvements. Historically, the state has issued every 10 years a capital bond to support facility renovations, and they have not done so in more than 30 years. And so as you look across the state of North Carolina, you can see the conditions of school buildings with respect to safety and health and educational adequacy and all the reasons why we would want to invest in our school facilities. We need increased flexibility for school districts to determine what's best for their communities and to stop political intrusion into the educational policies and practices. It's really disappointing to watch people who've never been involved in public education and who are so far removed of it sit in Raleigh and make decisions about how to provide instruction in the classroom. Teachers are trained to do this. Let them do their job. So what we can do. We can choose candidates who actively support public education. And I'm stressing that word actively because oftentimes when elections come, you will hear folks talk about their commitment to education. But when you look at what they actually do, their actions don't support their words. But in November, we have an opportunity to elect the next North Carolina Superintendent of Instructions. And I will not be political, but I will tell you the difference between the two candidates we have could not be clearer. One of the candidates has long been a champion for public education in North Carolina. He's been involved as a school district superintendent. He has professional work in education. And the other candidate was at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And I could stop there, but it just keeps going. She espouses anti-LGBT, anti-science views. She actively advocates for public education of elected officials. And you might think it sounds extreme, and it is, but it's all true. And she's called public schools socialism centers. So I just cannot imagine why she would even be interested in trying to oversee our state's public school system, where she would have the ability to set educational priorities and manage school budgets and implement curriculum standards. I just imagine the damage that would do to public education in North Carolina. And so one thing we can do that we have power is really vet our candidates and make sure we're actively advocating for and supporting those folks who do support public education. The other thing is encourage friends and loved ones across the state. So we're really fortunate in Orange County that our local legislators are deeply invested in education, and they actively support and vote to fund education. But that's not true in every part of the state. So where we have friends or people who we can influence in other parts of the state to talk to their legislators to emphasize the importance of investing in public education, I would encourage us to take those opportunities to do that. And then I think, follow and support organizations like the Chapel Hill-Carrboro Public School Foundation. They do amazing work in support of teachers and staff, really supplementing and providing resources that the state doesn't do. There are other organizations like the North Carolina Public School Forum that's doing some great work in bringing business leaders. We sort of tried everything we could in terms of advocacy, and we think that this may be one way to get the legislature to listen to us, because the only people they seem to listen to are business leaders. And so the Public School Forum has worked with some other groups to bring business leaders together to help understand what the education issues are, and have conversations with their elected representatives. And there's another organization called the Public Schools First that has really great communication around what's happening in legislation related to education and support of public schools in North Carolina. And so I'll just end with, again, education is the most powerful tool you can use to change the world, by Nelson Mandela. So I would just encourage us all to continue the work that we're doing and work together to go change the world. And thank you for your interest, and thank you for all the work you do. I mean, I think it shows how much you care about what happens around you, that you're here at 6:30 in the evening, listening to a talk about public education. So that's all the remarks I had. Happy to answer any questions or expound on anything.
Any open for questions, Ruth?
All right, would you tell us more about of the 5